So I'm supposed to talk about the state of existing research and future research opportunities in the economics of biomedical innovation. That's a lot better. There are a lot of potential areas to explore, but I'm going to talk about 4 of them in particular. The impact of regulation on innovative effort, how profit potential affects innovative effort and innovative output, kind of broad welfare questions, such as do the returns from innovation in the aggregate justify the cost of innovation? And then more focused welfare analyses, what are the relevant benefits and costs of specific innovations and specific public policies? And one could extend that to ask about the relative costs and benefits of managerial practices that might affect the pace of innovation. Some quick preliminaries. Medical innovation is obviously of great importance, and medical innovation is thought to be perhaps the leading contributor to rising costs and improved quality over the long term. It's a heavily regulated, and as we've discussed, a heavily politicized market. And also innovations take many forms. And while pharma innovation receives the lion's share of attention, it doesn't necessarily create the lion's share of value. I'll be spending some time talking about medical procedure innovation, which has been all but overlooked in our research. Let me just start with some of the challenges when doing research in this area. As I've already suggested, there's different types of innovation. There's product innovation, drugs, small molecules versus biologicals, which have different scientific properties. Just the concept of a generic in biologicals is something we're having a hard time wrapping our heads around. And then you have procedure innovation. And each of these presents challenges in terms of how we measure the inputs into the production of innovation and how we measure the outputs. As well, the results that we get might be incomparable. We might not be able to compare the pace of drug innovation versus the pace of procedure innovation, simply because of the very different natures of the data and how we would measure the products themselves. How do we measure outputs? Well, for drugs, we usually look at patents. There are lots of them, which is great for empiricists, and they're well documented, but they're very far removed from the end product, and not all patents are created equal. Once you get to medical procedures, well, most innovations in medical procedures are not associated with patents. At best, there will be a patent for a device, but as I'll show you later, there's lots of reasons to think that most of the value creation in procedures is not associated with the specific devices. We could also measure output through sales, but there are a few new drug approvals every year, so we have a small numbers problem. There's also a long lag between innovative effort and the sales of products, so directly linking specific interventions that might take place in year T to sales that we might not realize until years T plus 10 or T plus 15 becomes very, very difficult. Now, there's also lots of data available on intermediate stages of research, such as clinical trials. This gives you lots of large numbers for data analysis, but it's still removed from the end product. In some ways, it's merely a compromise of the problems we have with using patents on the one extreme and sales on the other. That said, some of my own research now is using clinical trials. Then there are issues with measuring welfare. The assignment of welfare to innovative effort may be difficult. One reason is that we typically rely on sales as a measure of welfare benefits, but often what you have in pharma is you have a first mover that comes to the market and others see the nature of the scientific innovation and they build off that scientific innovation to become a second mover, and the second mover may be the big seller, but without the first innovation, we might not have ever seen the second one. That makes it very difficult to ascribe value to specific innovators. There are also lots of issues in terms of the methodology we use to measure welfare, and I'm going to talk a lot about that as I go along. Let me just turn to the research that's been produced over the last nearly 5 decades of studying the economics of medical innovation, starting with Sam Peltzman's 1973 paper on the effect of the FDA amendments on the pace of new drug introductions, showing a dramatic reduction in new drugs coming to the market. Later studies, including my work with David Meltzer and a more recent study by Berger and Craig Garthwaite, who I think is tuning in, has suggested that the FDA may be working to either minimize review lag, so they're being proactive in trying to get drugs to the market, or just the FDA imprimatur of quality may actually boost sales, and in that way may encourage more innovation. Budish et al. Likewise find that the FDA efforts to minimize the review times for certain types of cancer drugs did lead to additional investment in research in those drugs. And lastly, probably the best cited of all the work on pharma innovation comes from the Tufts Center's decennial studies of the cost of drug development. And when you see newspapers reporting that drug development costs $2 billion or more per drug that reaches the market, that's coming from the Tufts Center. The methodology is not without controversy, and I won't talk more about that here. In terms of studies of the innovator's response to incentives, Ward and Dranove from 95, Asimoglu and Lin 2004, Dubois et al. 2015, all examine how long-term trends in epidemiology and demographics affect innovative activity. More recently, Bloom, Cahoot, and Sood and Dranove et al. Have examined how a shock to demand caused by Medicare Part D has affected the development of drugs targeting seniors. And Aga et al. In a recent paper show how PBM formularies, which drive down the prices for drugs where there's competition, may be reducing innovative effort in those categories that are most competitive. So I think the literature shows convincingly that drug innovators respond to incentives, and one could even back out the elasticities of supply of innovation, albeit with large standard errors. And the pharmaceutical industry has used this kind of information to defend its prices and challenge all kinds of regulatory constraints, such as allowing for importation from Canada or allowing Medicare to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs. But the critics of the industry remain unmoved. For one reason, the industry argument that more profits means more innovation has no limiting principle. When do we decide that we've given up enough of the GDP to the pharma industry and the returns to innovation are no longer high enough? So you can't just use the directional result to reach policy conclusions. What we really need to do is understand the welfare benefits of additional research and determine whether that justifies the costs. So let me turn to the two main welfare questions that the literature has addressed. The first is very broadly, do returns from innovation justify the cost? And David Cutler, with a variety of co-authors, including Mark McClellan, have asked the question, is technological change in medicine worth it? That's actually the title of David and Mark's very famous paper in Health Affairs. They examine the extensive margin of new innovations, and their conclusion is yes. And in order to reach that conclusion, they use medical literature on how much innovation improves the quality and quantity of life. And they use economics or just accounting data to look at the cost associated with treating the conditions that the innovations have affected. And they apply to the improvements in health status or the increase in life expectancy a hedonic estimate of the value of a life derived from surveys or from labor market studies, or often sort of a compromise of the numbers that you would get from a variety of studies. So on average, we could say we benefited from medical innovation, even though healthcare spending is higher, we live longer, and it's worth it. But how does this inform either government or management policy is just not clear. So let's talk about the research on the benefits and costs of specific innovations and specific public policies. There are two types of ways in which these innovations can help us. So it might be helpful to just briefly mention those. First is when new products substitute for existing products in the market. And the biggest benefit there may come from price reductions and quantity expansions. There's surprisingly little research on just how much the introduction of new pharmaceutical products affects the pricing of existing products, partly due to the difficulty of obtaining the appropriate price data. The other way in which innovation matters, and I would argue probably the lion's share of the welfare benefits come from this, is through new products that offer significant improvements in the quality or quantity of life. And a classic example of this type of paper would be Trachtenberg's 1989 estimate of the benefits of CAT scans, which were new at the time. What Trachtenberg does in this paper is kind of representative of how modern IO economists think about doing valuation, which is he estimates a demand curve for CTs. He assumes that the demand curve can be used to understand the revealed preference and therefore the valuation of CTs. And he integrates under the demand curve to get the value of the new product introduction. But I think there's reason to be cautious about taking this structural approach that does rely on revealed preference. And it's one reason why I think I'm skeptical about how far we're going to be able to push this direction for research. I have two high-level concerns. The first is that if we're going to do this in any broad way, try and estimate the impact, say, of allowing importation, you're going to have to estimate a lot of demand curves. We're going to need to know the prices facing the consumers, not the prices paid to the drug companies, because we're modeling the demand side. We need to know consumer-facing prices. But I have a lot of concerns as well about using the revealed preference approach with this kind of data to infer value. We know that when patients make purchase decisions in the face of cost sharing and deductibles, they don't act like we think they should if they were making rational decisions. The whole concept of value-based insurance design, which is gaining widespread popularity amongst insurers and in Medicare as well, is premised on the notion that left to their own devices, consumers don't make the right healthcare decisions. They don't do things that ex post they wish they would have done. Brock Goldberg et al., QJ 2017, show that when faced with deductibles, consumers do not make purchases based on the true economic prices that face them. So using revealed preference methods to infer valuation is problematic because consumers really perhaps aren't revealing their true preferences when they make their decisions. There's also a question as to whether revealed preference truly reveals the societal valuations of innovations when consumers are liquidity constrained when they make their purchase decisions. Just consider the following. We know that there are a lot of patients who do not take drugs that are literally a matter of life and death for them when they face something as small as a $50 cost share. If you give them a coupon for $50, they'll take the drug, 50 out of their own pocket, they won't. Many of them just don't have $50 worth of liquidity. But I doubt that the societal valuation of that product would really be bounded by 0 and 50, based on the fact that they're not buying the product when they have to pay 50 for it. Lastly, I should note that our standard approach for estimating the demand curves is going to rely on utility with type 1 extreme value errors. And while this is convenient, it's not clear that this is the right way to go about things. I know from looking at models that estimate demand for other products like insurance and hospitals, you get suspiciously high valuations to adding additional choices. They all pile on to the error term in these models, and that's not obvious what that's all about to me. One thing that's occurred to me since I wrote the little paper that I submitted was that the question of what's the value of having access to a new drug closely resembles the question, what's the value of having access to a hospital? And we have developed methods to answer that question. If we have market share data, we could estimate what's called willingness to pay in the hospital choice literature. And if we had information about insurance premiums that for policies that have different hospital networks, we can actually infer the value in dollars that a hospital brings to a network. You know, Kate Ho is listening out there somewhere. Hi, Kate, if you're still there. I think it was her job market paper that did just this, and others have done it since. I'm wondering if we could use the same thing for drugs. There are a lot of questions that arise as we think about doing that, but it might be a fruitful area for research. There are two alternative approaches to answering this question: how might a specific public policy affect welfare? One is to simply go a bit beyond the existing literature, which says, yes, there's a supply response, to try to refine our understanding of the supply response. So Craig and Manuel Hermosillo, who's at Johns Hopkins, and I have a paper that separates the supply response for scientifically novel innovations versus scientific innovations that follow existing science. And rather depressingly, we find that the Medicare Part D shock had a very substantial effect on what we could call Me Too innovations, but had a very small effect with a very long lag on what we would call breakthrough innovations. The other approach is to actually try to put welfare measures on the value of innovations, but not rely on structural methods and reveal preference, but instead rely on the hedonic valuations that I talked about that David Cutler, for example, was using in his technology worth it literature. And so in one study, Finkelstein, it's 2004, I think this was her job market paper, which is remarkable to think about it because such an amazing study, looks at several programs that incentivize vaccine production. More recently, there was the Budish et al. Paper I talked about and cancer research. And in order to figure out the dollar values of the increased innovation that they observe, they use something like $100,000 per year of life gained as a measure of the benefits of innovation. That said, as I think you're going to hear from Brad in just a bit, it's a lot of people who question whether this is a legitimate way to put a dollar value on innovation. So the other thing I want to say about that is it's not clear how easily it's going to generalize. They took advantage of some real good identification, which might not generalize to most innovations. Now it's time for my table. And I'm going to try to do this as my last thing, and then I'll wrap up. Everything I've talked about, my slide, please. There it is. I've been talking about drug innovation, all the research you find here, with very few exceptions. So Ariel Stern has got a couple of papers on bringing medical devices through the approval process. But otherwise, pretty much everything is on drugs, but there's so much going on with medical procedures. And this is table one from a working paper I have with Craig and with Bingjiao Wu, who's at Rutgers University. This is showing the medical procedures which Medicare has the highest spending. And you can see in terms of the numbers of patients and the dollar amounts involved, these are clearly very, very important. Now we document these using CPT or current procedural terminology codes, which already tells you that there's something weird going on with medical procedures. For drugs, we could identify them through patents or through the research approval pipeline. But for medical procedures, there's no systematic way of collecting data on what procedures are under development, let alone introduced to the public, except when they get billing codes or CPT codes. The American Medical Association has generally given us access to CPT applications, and we're now able to report things like how long does it take to bring a new medical procedure from initial research to final CPT approval, what's the impact of approval on sales, and even identify the initial innovators, just like the initial patent holders for drugs. We can identify the initial publishers of research on medical innovations and identify like what happened to their careers. Did their careers take off? Did they get to start companies and so forth? And we are working a lot on that, but it misses a lot. The reason it misses a lot is of all of these procedures that are up here, TAVR, transcatheter aortic valve replacement, is the only one that has a clear new CPT code associated with it. And in fact, all of the others are ridiculously old in terms of when they first were introduced. The dialysis of today is not the dialysis of 1943. And the improvements to dialysis have been palpable, and they're very difficult to document in any systematic way. So it's just really difficult to document innovation. Also to figure out what the incentives are to innovators, and therefore to figure out the right regulatory and market frameworks for promoting innovation in procedures, we think is going to be even harder than what we think it is for drugs. So let me close by talking about areas for future research. Let me just repeat the four broad questions, and you can take down the slide. Thank you. The questions were the impact of regulation on innovative effort, how profit potential affects innovative effort and innovative output, broad welfare analysis, do the returns of innovation justify the high costs, and focused welfare analyses, what are the relevant benefits and costs of specific innovations and specific public policies. I think we have pretty good answers for the first three, especially for small molecules of traditional drugs. Question 4, the one that will most inform policy, remains largely unanswered, I believe. And not to beat a dead horse, I think we have no answers for any of these questions for procedure innovation. So going forward, I think we have to think harder about how we measure the welfare gains from innovative activities. Can we really use revealed preference with structural modeling? Gets us answers, but will we believe them? Can we take the willingness to pay approach that we've used for hospitals? I think we just started to think about that. And there's a number of people here who will probably be able to think that through more deeply than I can. Do we believe the hedonic valuations that people are applying in studies like Finkelstein and Budish et al.? And how does innovation affect competitive pricing? I want to return to that. So maybe new technology is worth it, but we need to know the mechanisms. And it's only if we know the mechanisms that we'll know what policies and incentives lead to what kinds of innovations. Now, this is a question I think has been on the table for decades. And let me close by saying that I cut my academic teeth here at the University of Chicago. I spent my first 8 years of my career here. And the Chicago school blood still runs through my veins. So I'm tempted to conclude that if we have a really important policy question or set of policy questions, if somebody could answer these questions and make great advances to their career, so there's value to answering these questions, and for 50 years they haven't been answered, that suggests to me that they might be a lot harder to answer than we might have thought. And I'm hoping through our discussion, maybe Brad and Scott can prove me wrong, but I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.